Hi everybody, my name is Isabel May. I am an associate professor and the director of the Science Communication Certificate Program in the UMB's Graduate School. And I also serve as the director of our UMB Writing Center. And I'll talk a little bit more about who I am, my background in just a moment. But welcome to this short recording on giving you all a very brief, and a very brief introduction to writing across the curriculum and some tips and tricks and some things to think about of maybe including this approach in your teaching as you're including writing assignments in your courses. And the caveat is also that this presentation and take on writing across the curriculum is very much based on my own personal experience as a writer, as a writing instructor, as an educator of graduate students. So somebody else would give probably a very different presentation. So let's get started. A little bit before I get started about myself, I did want to focus us on our land acknowledgement. I won't read this out to you, but I do find land acknowledgements play an important role in our not just institutional but also national global commitment to acknowledge and ultimately repair the damages done to Indigenous communities. And I'm going to click on the link to our Writing Center's land acknowledgement just very briefly. It'll come up here in a second. The text that we've written in collaboration with representatives of Indigenous groups is really important, and we're very and I say we, it's mostly my team in the Writing Center has worked hard on this, specifically my colleague James Wright. But I want to point to you these organizations here that if you are interested and you haven't heard of these before, please check them out, consider donating or supporting them in whatever shape or form, because all these organizations support Indigenous rights, social justice for Indigenous Black communities and other communities of color within Baltimore and the larger region. And then some additional resources here as well. So check it out. Okay, getting back to the presentation. A little bit about me. I'm a cisgendered heterosexual monogamous white female, identify as working class, but certainly I'm now firmly of a middle class. I'm a child of Slovak immigrants, born and raised in Germany. I grew up bilingual, so I'm a multilingual learner of English. I raised Catholic, but more in the Episcopalian church. I got married there. I'm a mother of an almost 4-year-old. I'm able-bodied. I believe in Christian values and spiritual values. And my background is a humanities trained interdisciplinary scholar focusing on science communication practices and wishes to promote social justice-oriented and equitable science communication practices. Part of that being writing across the curriculum. You might be wondering, why is she going on about her background? I find this practice, particularly as a white identifying individual, extremely important to kind of ground myself with my audience of where I'm coming from, so that if folks know where my biases might lie and certain areas that I might might have to work harder on paying attention to, particularly when assessing student writing, when working with other writers and so on. And I've taken this activity, I'm just going to click on it very quickly, from something that many of you might have seen. It's called a social identity wheel. This comes from University of Michigan. It's a beautiful tool to use with students, with colleagues in different settings. So wanted to make that available to you. So let's talk about writing across the curriculum, which is a practice. It's been around for several decades, a movement really in academia and the teaching of writing, predominantly in the undergraduate level in college settings, university settings for the undergraduates. But there are some applications and some research has been done on it as well for graduate level. And when I get to the end of this recording, I'll show a slide with some additional resources, and I'll point out some things on there around graduate writing and writing in the curriculum. So writing across the curriculum, or WAC, as we lovingly call it, is a nationwide movement designed to ensure that students have frequent and significant opportunities to write, revise, and discuss their writing in their classes. WAC is defined by its decentered pedagogy, moving away from the lecture mode of teaching to a model of active student engagement. So a big piece of writing across the curriculum approaches to integrating writing into your discipline-specific classrooms has a lot to do with as this quote suggests from Penn State Berks about called "What is Writing Across the Curriculum," it really asks us to center on engagement, on student engagement within the classroom with writing, and providing students plenty of opportunities to have their writings revised, to revise it, to get feedback from us, and so on. And I'll talk about this a lot throughout today's recording, so you'll hear me saying this a lot. But I love this very succinct way that Penn State Berks WAC program has defined it. I think when we then talk about writing across the curriculum, and I'm just going to continue using WAC as the acronym, so when I say WAC, that's what I mean. A lot of graduate level instruction or assessment around writing in WAC classrooms has to do with genres. And let me just talk a little bit about what I mean when I say the term genre. So genre is a stylistic category of writing, right? It's a literature review, could be a research paper, report, op-ed, the type of writing, the type of larger structure of writing that we used to with different audiences. So we in academic writing use a research paper a lot, a newspaper article, op-ed being an example, is another genre, and there's subgenres within larger genres. And I'm pointing this out here because engaging graduate students, particularly grad students, in conversations around the different genres they have to be producing, be it grants, research papers, proposals, etc. Those are the most frequent ones for an academic career, right? Should sound familiar to many of you, certainly does to me. Our instruction really should be centered on genre. When we talk about writing across the curriculum, really taking seriously this charge of engaging our students in writing practices a lot and continuously throughout our content-focused teaching. It's a foundational category in writing pedagogy, so we folks in writing pedagogy, writing assessment talk about genre all the time. And other terminology that is often used with what we call genre-based writing pedagogy, which really is at the core of WAC for graduate students, are what we call the rhetorical situation and rhetorical move. So let me explain to you, because these are really useful terms to explore with your students and then to use as sort of signposts and guideposts throughout your teaching and your assessment of writing in your classrooms. So let me start with what the term rhetoric actually means. Might have been a while for some of you, maybe take an introduction to rhetoric and writing. I certainly took one a long time ago in Germany, which is where I'm from originally, where I started university. But rhetoric, in short, and this is very, very brief and very superficial in a way, it's a term that describes the art and craft of persuasion. And I do like this emphasis on persuasion because sometimes I think we forget that even academic writing, yes, it is fact-based, especially our research papers. They're based on methodologies and methods that we think very carefully through in terms of adequate measures of certain effects. But we are still at the same time also trying to persuade our reader of the importance of our work. So ultimately, I would argue that a lot of academic writing has a lot of elements of persuasion in there, right? So someone who studies rhetoric is considered an expert, and it's often called a rhetorician, just to throw some other terms out there. So what's really important, I find, is rhetoric is a field of study that is interested in understanding how to communicate, right? And don't we all want our students to communicate effectively? Absolutely. And when students really get really effective at that, it really improves their understanding of the content as well. So I think writing and content teaching go hand in hand. So the core concept in rhetoric is what I mentioned earlier, the rhetorical situation. And we often use a triangle to explain it. Here is a link to a YouTube video that's very basic that I recorded for our writing center. I use it in my teaching. If you want to take a look at it, it's a few minutes long. You have the link here. And it's often, so again, the rhetorical situation is often understood as a triangle. And the three parts of the triangle are audience, communicator or voice, and issue and subject. So what we basically do when we're trying to communicate, this is what we have to deal with every communication situation. With any moment, whenever we communicate, and this could be in writing, in speaking, this is certainly what I'm doing right now, we have to think about who are our audiences. So it probably should be plural, their audiences, because we often have more than just one type of audience. Like, who are our audiences? Who are the people we want to reach with our piece of communication? Who am I? What's my position? Who am I as a communicator? What do I bring to the table? What is my voice? And then, of course, what is the issue, the subject I'm discussing? And these three elements constantly influence each other as we are producing our pieces of communication. Again, I'm focusing mostly on writing and writing in a scholarly context, but it really is much broader than that. And so I think students think through this sort of triangular relationship, and there's some other, I've seen some other types of diagrams out there that use 4 elements of rhetorical situation, and I forgot what the 4th part was. It was a little different than this traditional triangle, but what all of these get at is this symbiotic relationship of the different elements that go into a piece of communication. And often when we're writing, especially with, well, I find especially novice writers, right, early graduate students being the master's or doctoral program, tend to be so focused on their own voice and on the subject, they tend to forget the audience. And they think of just their PI or their doctoral advisor or their course instructor as the audience. Whereas I think what we want them to think of is a much broader audience than just us, right? Because we want them to really hone their skill and their practice as writers for a variety of audiences. So again, it's a useful concept that I encourage you to integrate into your teaching and your discussion with your students around writing in your classrooms. Now, when we talk about these, standards or common practices of communication, we do have to acknowledge that our current communication standards in the United States, here in North America, and in most parts of the world that use English, sort of Western English as a basic language norm, these conventions, both genre conventions, language conventions, etc., are based on white language supremacy, influenced by Western colonization, anti-blackness, and the devaluation of other Englishes, such as African American vernacular English or non-American and non-British forms of English. And that's something that we really have to keep in mind. And I would encourage you all as well to be very upfront about this, and also with your students, and even engage your students in conversations around this. If you need some support on this, how to do this, this is just an introduction. I'm always available for conversations, so is my colleague James Wright. We both work on these type of writing across the curriculum and writing program activities with faculty all over our university, and we've done this at other institutions as well. So feel free to use this as a resource. But in this day and age, certainly, if not always, I'm fine, but certainly now, we've come to this really turning point, I think, in our approach towards educating young minds, that we think we're tasked, and particularly based on our institution's strategic plan, we're tasked to really integrate equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts into all of what we do. And this is certainly one way to acknowledge it, and also to give students an understanding that there are other ways to communicate. And I'll show an example at the end in the resource section, just as one example that you might want to look at, and it might be interesting to explore that either by yourself or even with your students in classrooms. So the other piece I wanted to, another scholar I want to introduce you to is Christine Tardy, who's written about this concept of genre innovation. And I think that's another interesting terminology or concept to take into your teaching practice and your writing assessment practice, because we think of the genres we use as very static, right? It's our tendency. But genres get constantly innovated and changed. Their change is like language change. They're not static. They can be and are adapted based on context. So a research paper written, and this is certainly true for disciplines, written in pharmaceutical sciences compared to a research manuscript written in the in biology, compared to astronomy, compared to environmental sciences, compared to sociology, they're going to look very different. So right there, the genre of the quote-unquote research paper has some variation built into it based on discipline-specific contexts, right? And that's, of course, we want to train our students to be really effective in discipline-specific communications, but also in interdisciplinary contexts and broader contexts than just academic writing. So the genre innovation, something, I've done an activity with my students in my science communication class where we've looked at research articles, excuse me, in one discipline in similar journals for the past 100 years. And it's amazing the differences that we see. So genres have continued and continue to develop over time. They negotiate differently in different cultural contexts. Research papers might look different in articles, in journals published by let's say folks in Britain compared to Kenya, compared to Myanmar, compared to Venezuela, compared to New Zealand, right? Even though all of these are published in English, there might be some cultural differences that that to us might look weird or wrong, but can be the exact opposite. So this idea of objective categories for certain genres is really something that is not nearly as static as we think it is. And I'm going to end the first video here to give you a break because we're at 50 minutes. And the second video, I'll continue talking more about rhetorical moves and show you some examples from my own teaching that hopefully will be useful to you.